Okay, so welcome to the third series of the FRSA podcast, Priority Message, and what is the first episode of the new series. I'm Tristan Ashby, the Chief Executive Officer of the FRSA, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the pod Dr Steve Sadler. Hello, Steve. Do I need to call you Dr. Steve or Mr. Sadler?
Oh, no. Generally, I think titles divide us.
Oh, they do.
Yes, and not want to, but with some feedback I received in the last year from people I respect tremendously, who I might even name drop later on in this podcast, it seemed to make sense to use it in this context. So occasionally I use it, especially when I'm trying to, wear the moniker of researcher. It was a hard-earned title, more from perseverance, tenacity, and determination to get to the end of it, which everybody will probably speak to with their PhDs, rather than intellectual prowess.
So I'm going to try and give the listener, the viewer, your background, and I do hope I get this right, because if not, I'm going to look very silly. You are the director and founder of the company Re-Enkindle, which, among other things, looks at maximising on-call appliance availability. You're an on-call firefighter with operational experience from 4 fire and rescue services, namely Cornwall, Devon and Somerset, Staffordshire, and currently Shropshire. Good so far. You're a consultant for Fire Service Rota. You've acted as consultant for Lancashire Fire and Rescue, Kent Fire and Rescue, Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue. Worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at Keele University in Staffordshire. You've authored several commissioned papers and delivered projects that have directly influenced strategic advancements aimed at augmenting availability, always with a focus on tangible, impactful results. And you are referred to, I think this is the best bit, you are referred to as an on-call technical advisor, offering the support, insights and strategies to streamline progress through research and data. Hopefully that is you. I've got the right Steve Sadler.
Wow, yeah, and I didn't even write that one. I don't recall. Yeah, so yeah, wow, that's very kind. Thank you. That's
No, well deserved. We've been talking in the background about getting you on the pod for quite a while. So hands up, that's all my fault. It's just really finding the time. And I know we've got Dee and John coming from Lancashire onto the pod this year. That's going to be very interesting. But you obviously have done the job or doing the job of on-call. You completely get it, but you take it to a completely different level in terms of being an academic and look at things in a very different way to other people. And most importantly, look for outcomes, look for measurable outcomes that ensure positive deliverability. So I'm pretty much for the next hour-ish, I'm going to sit back, relax and listen and be educated. If you can tell us, if you can just give us the backstory from how you first touched the fire and rescue service all the way through to the present day, that would be great.
Okay, wow, yeah. I'll try my very best. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me on. I'm humbled to be here. Really, it's a privilege to be on your podcast, and it's whatever people may think of unions ultimately, which can often be an ambivalent issue for people. My experience of them is wholly good. In the fire context, there's, in my opinion, so crucial, not only for, as you're doing, raising awareness of the big issues, but also being a part of venerable institutions, a self-correcting mechanism, a means by which to check, and for those internally to check, not as in like somebody criticizing, but somebody who can be leaned on to give good advice to steer the ship of the fire and rescue service in the right direction. And as I say, to raise awareness, some of the work you've done on social media with the research, which we'll touch on, your research in 2017, which was kind of seminal in my journey to where I am today, really. I think that was a terrific survey that you did of on-call firefighters across the UK back then, and still resonates today, as I shared recently on social media. I think that raising awareness is a key part of the challenge that we have in augmenting availability, sustaining availability of on-call fire engines, and kind of letting on-call firefighters know how valuable they are, especially as you do a really good job of letting us know about those that have done 30 years, 40 years, 50 years already in the service.
It's a phenomenal achievement. It really is.
Just phenomenal. Consider also the tremendous, which I'm sure we'll get to, the economic and social value of the service and those people within it. What they're providing on a weekly basis is just incredible. It's an incredible commitment. And as you know, the legend that now is Kevin Ted said on a preceding FRSA podcast, it really speaks to the sort of the recognition that we need from these people, of these people that are so passionate, really, and so a big part of the on-call landscape. So yeah, I really enjoyed. I wanted to apologies in advance for two things today, Tristan. Is that one, I'm still on call, as you put out. So if need be, I've got to go, as Kevin was, I believe, when you last spoke to him. But also, if I name drop too much, there's been so many people on this journey, not only my career, but this sort of second part of the career where I've brought research to bear into the sector. And it's hard not to talk to you today and sort of name drop some of those, including the watch manager at my local station, who I'm on call with right now, Phil Bembo. He's probably one of the best, and I'm sure he won't mind me name dropping him. He's just, I think, probably one of the best practitioners of the on-call that there is out there, really.
So let me just stop you there then, because I think that's an interesting point with regards to your watch manager and Kevin Ted's. Has anybody ever looked at what makes a good watch manager? Because the watch manager, in my opinion, makes the station tick. It can succeed or fail depending on how good that watch manager is, not just at being operational, but just as important, if not more important, on managing the crew.
So in terms of research, there was in 2011, the Fire Research Group did a big piece focusing on flexibility and got a lot of respondents from station managers. And kind of at the time then, you'll remember, often watch managers were referred to as station managers, and there's been a change in that dynamic over time. So there was that data captured would have included some of the feedback. But in terms of identifying what the characteristics are of a good watch manager, yeah, I tried to do that in the work that we'll get onto that I did with Shropshire to a point, in trying to look at what is the culture within the on-call context, which is conducive to high performance, conducive to good availability, conducive to health and well-being, what works in an on-call context. Because you're right, one of the things that came out from that was the importance of watch managers. So not just at their station, I would say as a powerful cohort that are the voice for on-call firefighters back into the organisation, as you'll know, with their, often in many services, they have their weekly, monthly watch manager meeting, but they're also really important as a conduit for communication. They're effectively mediating all the time the information that's coming from the service, from the senior level, into the on-call stations, because as you and I both know, and many of your guests have spoke to previously, communication is a huge part of the challenge for retention in on-call context, in terms of making sure that communication isn't onerous, doesn't create more problems than it solves, that it's effectively as short, high in quality, low on quantity, timely and relevant as possible. And in order to allow on-call firefighters to get on them with their limited time available to them, to drill and to do things that are meaningful to them. So yeah, I think watch managers are, absolutely incredible. And I would also say, and I think you were at the conference in Shropshire in 2022, when I gave a standing ovation, a round of applause to all the watch managers in the room in Shropshire, because all I talked about was things like, fire service rotor and the software that was being used and how we could use data more smartly. Something, again, I'm sure we're going to get onto over the course of this hour. And I know you've spoken with Connor a couple of weeks ago really well about that use of data in the sector. But I said that there's no software in the world that can strategically workforce plan as well, as dynamically and as effectively than a watch manager, who may be, in the case of Phil Bembo, on his tractor any given day, taking calls, using fire service radar, juggling availability, making sure that the workforce functions flexibly. And they're astonishing. Watch managers are probably the most important group of cohort within an on-call context, I think. But I know we digress already. This might be
it's easily done.
Flavor of the chat. Yeah, go on forever. Can I?
So you went to Cornwall. That was your first experience of being on call. Beautiful part of the country.
Oh yeah, beautiful, yeah, and a great fire and rescue service, my formative time, which is always powerful for people. I just want to add to my intro, because I'd be remiss if I didn't, that I'm also a partner of one, father of two, which is very important in this context, because right now, just like many other on-call firefighters, the 8,000 of them around England, we're going to be juggling the priorities of the family, what we have to do on a daily basis with that family. And in my case, I work at home, so I'm close to them, but I'm, also being on call, doing my day job, talking to you, and juggling those commitments. And they are the goodwill that they give me, and that families all around the UK give to on-call firefighters, which really do allow them to do the job, as such a crucial part. And that's why it goes back to that point of awareness. The more we can raise awareness, raise value in the local community of the role, that helps get people like me dispensation to do the job, because my family recognises the value I'm offering and how we're cohering in our community. And that allows me, when I go off for 2-3 hours at a time, without prior warning, to get that buy-in from the family, and they continue to support me. So I had to say that.
No, and you're absolutely right. So it's remiss of me not to, because we were talking about people who are doing 30, even 40, even 50 years service. It's an amazing contribution and commitment, but not just of them, but of their partners and of their close family and friends. Yeah. Because you're right, without them, you couldn't just drop everything, leave the shopping in Sainsbury's and just go, or whatever, because someone always needs to be there to pick up the pieces.
That's right.
And I think,
I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, to segue back into Cornwall. I wasn't a father at the time in Cornwall. It was just me, a partner. Unlike many others who joined the fire and rescue service, it wasn't big on my radar, but I saw that big banner in the community that said, "Would you like to join?" And I thought two things. One, I was non-Cornish, as coming from Nottingham originally, and I wanted to get entrenched and involved in the community. And also, being an academic, being somebody who's done a sedentary job, I thought my weakness is probably being practical. My weakness is probably like getting stuck into things. So how about I do that? Work on a weakness and contribute to the community. So that was my sort of door into Cornwall, really.
Got the taste for it.
And Cornwall was then the first service where, and I've shared this before, I think, where when I was available, given a huge amount of hours each week, like many of my colleagues, I would often turn out and the fire engine would not be available, not because of a dearth of people and on-call firefighters, but because of a shortage of skills. Now, IC skills, incident command, emergency response driving. And what I realized right at that early stage was, these moments when, I've been given my time and committed, but to no avail because the pump's not actually available. It's because of this effectively challenge with skills and lack of effective strategic workforce planning. So then I immediately knew that it was more than just about recruitment and retention, which is, as you well know, every focus of every paper. The three big reviews, Bain, Knight, Thomas, they always focus on recruitment and retention. And that was probably that experience sowed the seed of, this is multiple factors. This is more complex than just getting more people in. It's part of the problem, part of the challenge, but there's more to it than this, which then sort of meant that when I started to work in Devon and Somerset, which I did at the same time because I worked in Plymouth, and so I provided on-call cover in Devon and Somerset too, and did like a dual role at the time. I started to see the same challenges, but slightly different because I was available in the day more there, and so I saw this dynamic where there was less firefighters available in the daytime because they were working and so on. But then you can fast forward there, really. Fast forward to life's what happens while you're busy making plans. I had a young family, moved back up to the north, as it were, into Shropshire, and I transferred in to Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service and Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service because I valued the role, and because I knew that I was again going back into new communities, and that the Fire and Rescue Service was the best way to immediately get involved in that local community, make new friends and so on. So when I did that, transferred into both those services, I again saw the same perennial problem of on-call fire engine availability, albeit less in Shropshire. But in Staffordshire, I was there when the HMI got re-inaugurated really as the inspectorate in 2018-19, and was also then at Keele University, and went to and saw that this challenge was that which they were having in Staffordshire like everywhere else, and Staffordshire was unfortunate enough to get an area for improvement from the first HMI inspection. Needed to create an action plan, and I sort of thought at that point, has anybody truly got to grips with the multiple factors involved in on-call availability? And so I looked at a bit of literature, did a brief review, and realised that everything was focused heavily on recruitment and retention. So I went to Becky Bryant at the time, who was the chief, and said, hey, is there an opportunity here to help you, Staffordshire, with some academic research, working through Keele, to do some work that will support your creation of your action plan for your AFI? And I'm very grateful now to Becky and to Glyn Lugeny at the time, who's now the Deputy Chief Fire Officer, that they said yes, they had a good relationship with Keele. And I developed a research-led model of good practice for the availability of on-call fire engines. So I effectively did a huge literature review, looked at everything there was, and thanks to a great paper from somebody called Emily Lantz in Sweden, who's recently just produced another paper called Sharing is Caring, which is really good, I recommend to people. That sort of was my call to action to say, let's look beyond the UK in this literature review. Let's look beyond the term on-call and retained. Let's look to non-career firefighters in the US and Australia and New Zealand. Let's look toward volunteers, because what was increasingly clear, and Emily pointed out in her paper, was that there was a dearth of UK research, and that those terms divided us, because there were more often than not, there was just shared commonalities between the role, even where the term volunteer was used. Often it was a paid position, like an on-call firefighter in the UK. So I did this massive literature review, and then did something which is, in fancy academic terms, a thematic framework, and said, let's find out what these key themes are. And they went then beyond recruitment and retention and resignation to what I called the 3 S's, which was salary, strategic workforce planning and skills, and the 3 C's, probably the most important one, culture, as we touched on. What was the culture within the on-call that's conducive to good performance, communications and crewing? And then started to expand and say, what are the key metrics? What are the key things we can look at within each one of those themes, which will make an impact for, at the time, Staffordshire? What can they do with that framework, and how can they use their software? How can they use their data to strategically workforce plan? How can they recruit more effectively, and so on? So that's kind of where the journey goes, from being an on-call firefighter operationally to starting to be more and more focused on the organizational aspects, which I am now in my day job. And that fed forward then into Shropshire. So Shropshire, sorry, go on.
No, you can. I don't want to stop your flow.
I was going to say, so Shropshire, what happened was we did the work in Staffordshire, and then Shropshire at the time was, as it still remains today, excellent for on-call fire engine.
Oh God, it is. Yeah.
It's been there, it's been at 90+% for many, many, many years. And at the time, they were doing sustainability review, led by somebody called Steve Perks. There's another name drop there, a great watch manager at the time, crew manager in Shrewsbury in Shropshire. And they'd already done a lot of work into looking at how to sustain this success of good availability, including about a huge amount of staff engagement data. And so we had this idea, how about we use this research to underpin a separate project called Sustaining Success, where we'll integrate the sustainability review endeavours, engagement data with this research. And doing that created what I think is still today the biggest on-call project ever undertaken. There's about a lot of words in there, Tristan.
Well, it is, but that's over 2 years ago now. And yeah, I've got a lot of time for Shropshire. Over many years.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that they really value their on-call, and they do the right thing. And the conference that they held in what was something like September 2022 was brilliant. That's where we first met.
Yes.
Physically.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've got the presentation in front of me now, actually, which I'll probably link to in the show notes. And what they were looking to do, which they've implemented, as far as I'm aware, is it wasn't actually anything particularly new, but very much like the fire service does like to talk about stuff and then move on to the next thing without any implementation or measurement, etc.
Mhm.
So that was really, really good. But the point I was going to make, that's over 2 years ago, and I'm not aware of any other service tapping into it.
Mm.
Are you?
Well, yeah, the point I suppose about nothing new, the brief was definitely sustaining success. It was repeatedly, which is a phrase we've kind of heard a lot in the last 18 months, I suppose, Tristan, the national conferences and from yourself, is that, and from other leaders in Nottinghamshire and services that are being successful, is that it isn't broken. So we don't need to fix it. Damien West said, Kevin Ted said, TLC, bit of TLC need to do, as you pointed out, these things continually. It's a continual cycle of value, investment, recognition, and then all the smart little approaches just join them up. And so that's kind of what the brief was really for sustaining success, was to identify what the key areas of success were, and then to keep doing them rather than let's change something or for the sake of change. Let's actually just keep doing the right thing, but we need to know what the right thing is. So yeah. In that sense, it worked. And then, the research, I don't know, it's really hard to know as a researcher the extent to which your research ever reaches out to people, it ever makes an impact. And what I often find is that I don't realize until somebody comes to me and says, hey, I listened to you on a podcast, or I read your work, which was shared by X. And that's what we can get to, I suppose, is that that's where it's fed forward into working with other fire and rescue services, which, wherever possible, I've always recognised that each fire and rescue service is different. Everybody's doing the same thing, but they're all doing it a little bit differently. And so the way I work to go and look at a service and to identify, what their dynamic is, and then to apply the research and the insights that I've got as best I can, really. It's really hard to gauge the impact on other than, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning, is that as we've seen recently at the National Fire Chiefs Council, and as Lancashire have recently put on social media and shared, and Mid and West Wales are also happy to share, is that we're seeing some services not just sustain availability, but improve availability. So we've gone beyond the narrative of, is this sustainable, to actually, there's some services that are showing that with the right approaches, you heard from Kevin Ted, Nottingham as well, they're able to improve availability. I think Mid and West Wales has gone up by 2.4%.
Well, I was going to mention Mid and West and Craig because, Craig Flannery's so passionate about on call and the work you're doing and the work the brigade are doing to improve on call. He regularly updates me with a progress report, which is fantastic because not only are they not in decline, not only are they not stagnating, but they're improving. So it goes against the argument that it is broken, that on-call duty system can't function in the 21st century. Well, I'm afraid the evidence suggests it can. And if it can't, it's because you're not doing your job properly.
Yeah, it's also tremendously economically, socially, and culturally valuable. So where it does work, it's a bit of a digression, but there's a couple of common denominators of success that I identified in the first research with Staffordshire, which I've found to be true as I've then gone on and worked with services like Mid and West Wales, with Ireland is another good example. And that's that where you have a ratio of circa 65% on-call, you have a predominance of on-call staff and about 35% whole time, that is almost like a golden ratio, which that seems to feed forward into services that identify as an on-call service, like Shropshire, like Mid and West Wales, into systems of support, systems of work, systems whereby they use the availability software, for example, in ways which are conducive to getting the best and supporting their on-call workforce. That all comes from that ratio. So what we've seen is that is the case in Ireland, in Mid and West Wales, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Shropshire, in Mid and West Wales. And that seems to be a real benefit to actually do what Sir Ken Knight said in 2013, to consider using more on-call firefighters. Now, I know it could be counterintuitive, especially when there's things happening in the sector where some services are choosing to use less, as you talked about a lot, really, and drawn attention to in Warwickshire, for example. But fundamentally, those services that use more on-call firefighters are much more cost-effective and generally have good fire engine availability. And so Ken Knight drew attention to that, and he looked at the parallels with our European counterparts and said, this is the case. So it's a bit of a call to action. What I've done in some of my work is work out why, work out what happens when you've got that split. And a big part of it is the value, the recognition, the awareness of the role, the way the service is set up to support the role just increases, because you necessarily get more focus on that predominant workforce. And I think at the moment in England, about 17 fire and rescue services are those which have a predominance of on-call, that have about that split, particularly shire services.
Really?
Yeah. So I think that's a point. And then the other comment, so when I did the first research, I was trying to look, as you do, like a good researcher, for low-hanging fruit, for those common denominators of success. Is there a silver bullet? We heard, didn't we, at the National Fire Chiefs Council all the time, and everybody saying no. There was the one silver bullet that seemed to come out from that context of on-call services, on-call orientated services, was the use of software, was the use of fire service rota. Because what I found was that at the time, the top 3 performing services in the UK for on-call availability, which were Shropshire, Humberside and Nottinghamshire, all with 90% availability, all used fire service rota. And I know it's not, and to be clear, especially with my researcher hat on, I understand this is not causation, but there's a strong correlation here. And looking that in the Netherlands, where they really value their on-call, they have a high proportion of on-call. That's the system that most fire and rescue services use. Likewise in Falck, one of the world's largest fire and rescue services with about 2,500 on-call firefighters. They use fire service rota for primary alerting and for their availability system. So it was quite clear in the research, there's something to this as well. Well, what is it about fire service rota that works really well for the on-call and supports them? And it was in part because it's so simple. We talked about this before we came on air. It's so simple and straightforward to use, but it's also built by firefighters for firefighters, with those insights, with those people that recognize what does an on-call firefighter need, what does the service need to manage that availability, and it's software that's stood the test of time to support the on-call in that sense, really. So that was, 2 of those sort of common denominators of success were this valuing of the on-call, using more rather than less, and fire service rota, which segues nicely to Mid and West Wales, because they were a service that are identified as an on-call service, and they have a high ratio of on-call firefighters to whole-time firefighters. They just necessarily have to, because of the topography of Mid and West Wales. It's a massive land mass, and stations are spread out tremendously. So they're a huge part of the community resilience in Wales. And just because they then identify as an on-call service, and they always look to support them wherever they can, including great leaders like Craig, they get the best out of them. It's really as simple as that. As much as I've become this sort of, analyst, data-driven strategist, I still adhere to the maxim that culture is the best strategy. That in the context of the on-call culture, especially what did Sir Tom say at the Home Affairs Committee, culture is what happens when no one else is looking. That's never more true than in the context of an on-call station. But that's a good thing. That invariably, if you've engendered and cultivated a great culture at that local station, it makes them resilient, independent, effective, cost efficient. It's a tremendous way to run a business.
Yeah, it is. And I've never really looked at it in a huge amount of detail and focused on culture. I've just always said, the on-call unit just works because they have a particular ethos. They're there because they want to be there. They're not there for the money. They're there to give something back to the community, etc. And when you try and compare that with a watch and run it in the same way, as a lot of services have tried to do, unsurprisingly, it fails.
Yeah, and that was a big part of the work in Shropshire really, and the work in Staffordshire, was identifying what culture was conducive. And I think you might have heard me say this before, but the way to encapsulate it was with a very convenient acronym of FIRES, Tristan, which was this idea that above all, a characteristic of flexibility, inclusivity, the recognition we heard Kevin Tedds talk about a few weeks ago, empathy and support in the context of the on-call are really essential. They're the characteristics that, when engendered, seem to cultivate high performance, as well as it is the fire service. I suppose we've got to use the acronyms where we can, Tristan. The idea of CORES, which was CORES, CORES, this community-orientated recruitment and retention endeavours. Really, it's that's so key. In the absence of activity and the big red truck driving around local communities as much as less than it used to, the more we get out. As Kevin also said, I keep quoting Kevin, get firefighters in their kit, but it doesn't always have to be for operational activity. Firefighters love operational activity. That's what they sign up to do, and they want to self-actualize and fulfill that remit. But when you can't, or when there's breaks in between, anytime getting that fire, that big red cultural fire and rescue service symbol out into the local community is really key. And the more you can do that, then the more easy it is to recruit and retain, that's for sure.
Yeah, and obviously the call levels have gone down in general. That does need to be replaced for a number of reasons. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of getting that pump out, getting the uniform on. So many benefits from that. You're raising awareness within the community. It's a great opportunity to start a conversation with somebody who potentially could be the next on-call firefighter at that particular station. And I'm going to refer back to Craig again from Mid and West, because he reminded me also the fact that out of the 56 stations that they've got in the brigade, 37 now provide a response to a cardiac response, which is fantastic. And we have continually banged the drum that the broadening of the role issue needs to come to the table. It needs to come have a proper conversation with the relevant stakeholders to make sure that we're doing something, because too many people are leaving the service that don't need to leave, because either, I mean, not that they need the money to pay the mortgage, but you do need some income to justify when you're speaking to your partner and you're saying, well, we're going to have to stay around today. Or you're speaking to the rest of the family, well, we're going to have to spend, the evening here, the day here, the weekend here, etc. And if the compensation for that is minuscule, bearing in mind it's taxed fully through the allowance being on the primary occupation, then I'm afraid something's got to give. And normally it's the fire service. So if we can, as you say, get the truck out more, get the kit on more, do other things in and around the local community, everybody is a winner.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I know Craig's been a Mid and West Wales been leading the way in terms of broadening the role. And it's something I've talked about with Craig, really, because I don't know what you think. Have we been yet effective enough in articulating the value of that beyond what we're talking about now, really? There's maybe not a huge amount of work that's gone into demonstrating its value and in showcasing how well it works. And there's maybe an opportunity to do that in the future. And to speak to your point about the sort of dispensation it gets from family, that activity, as we touched on at the start of the conversation, when I go back into my family and I talk about the job, or they hear in the local community that, the local fire station has been out in the local community, doing something meaningful, invariably, like an RTC, that will also extend to having a cardiac arrest. That would also extend to doing anything in the community in the context of an emergency service response, which will not only in terms of activity that you're actively doing as an on-call firefighter, but in terms of that feedback into the family network and friend network to say, this on-call firefighter did this really valuable thing, last week, and they saved this person who invariably you will know, or by a few degrees of separation will know you, they'll know your family. That gives you a huge amount of buy-in, for the future, for when you're going out and it's not a cardiac arrest, it's not an RTC, and it's just an AFA or something that's maybe less and I don't use this word lightly, less interesting and exciting in your role as a firefighter.
Yeah.
So I know it's something that Craig's passionate about and that services are doing, and it's something that there's a huge amount of literature on it, but it's from elsewhere. So as you well know, firefighters, whether it's those in Sweden or those in the US, I've been doing this stuff. I've been doing both roles for a long time, really. I haven't come across a good body of literature that articulates effectively what its value is, if need be quantifying it in terms of its economic value, but also just really providing a robust, broad commentary on the value of it, even though many services are doing it. And if anybody who's listening, have some really good papers out there to share, I'd love to read them.
Well, it sounds to me as if there's a gap there that needs to be filled potentially by yourself, because in terms of the economic, social and cultural value, I think if that can be evidenced, as you're suggesting, that's something that would probably be well received at the top table in government, for them to really understand the fact that this is the right thing to do for numerous reasons. It's the right thing to do. But in terms of really putting a focus on the on-call, if somebody can, like yourself, demonstrate that value, it might just resonate with certain people, with ministers, etc. Because at the moment, one of the frustrations we've got with the past government, and so far 6 months, 7 months in the current government, there's that lack of focus, there's that lack of intensity, there's that lack of desire. I know they've got a number of things, a number of plates spinning, etc. But we need somebody to really get hold of this and drive it. And I know the NFCC are doing their bit, and that's fine and great. But probably being a bit critical, trying to be constructive of the organisation, not the people within it. The NFCC have had years to get on with this. The problem's not new. And yet we're still waiting. I know they're conducting their review, yet another review, which seems to be, the fashionable thing to do, whether it's locally or nationally. But I know we've spoken about this before. You quite rightly highlight the fact that, are we going to wait for an RNLI national campaign? Because if we are, we're probably going to be waiting a very, very long time. Or are we actually going to do stuff now that is achievable, that isn't necessarily extremely expensive? And I just would like your views on what could be done now, either locally, regionally, because it's not going to happen nationally. I don't think it is anyway. We've been talking about it for a good 20 years, easy, and nothing's come up yet. I know we've had the Need More campaign, which was well received, and I'll always name drop Terry McDermott for that, because he was principally the driving force behind that. And if he's listening, I wish him well. But what should we be doing today, Steve?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the NFCC work, they've done the economic and social value of the fire rescue service. They did
of fire in its entirety, yeah,
that's right. And it was a fledgling methodology, and it was something that's didn't necessarily have, and its remit wasn't to have a focus on the on-call as a huge element of that value proposition. And there is definitely work that can be done to do that, and it's something that I've been talking to certain people about, and to potentially articulate that economic, social and cultural value of the on-call, like you say, in order to empower people, to persuade people, to give it some political gravitas to the argument that we should be, even 11 years on, reflecting Sir Ken Knight's proposition that we should be spending to save in order to make the system sustainable, and that there are ways to do it smartly because it's already a tremendously cost-effective system. So that's definitely on my radar as a researcher and something to look at. And I know that, I think probably a good way now to name drop another person who you've already had on here on the Two Titans podcast, Steve Healy, who has he's done some fantastic work with the nationally. He's been a great supporter of me and my work, and I think he's doing a tremendous job, because it's challenging. It's to bring it to the table, to talk about it. It's only one element. The fire service has a lot of challenges at the moment, from culture to contaminants, and they all deserve to be a part of the conversation. Steve's ability to bring the right people together, including at the last conference, where we get a good comprehensive overview of what's happening across the United Kingdom and beyond, as well as supporting worthwhile initiatives, including the work that we did together on creating a piece of software that you're aware of. I think we talked about the NFCC, which is always on-call availability, recruitment and skills. Effectively, on this journey that I've been on, I've learned what we can measure. To quote Joseph Stiglitz, to measure the right things, to do the right things. And there are a number of things that we can measure more effectively in order to do the right things to improve availability. And Steve, as well as nationally being that advocate and that voice, his home service in Lancashire has supported that as well. We actually test bedded doors with Steve in Lancashire to support what he was already doing, which was great work with two people you mentioned, with Dee and with John Ross, and hopefully you will get to.
Yeah, that's why I'm keen to get them on. Yeah,
they've been so passionate. And they've done so many smart things, including applying the research that we've gone through, but also just of their own volition, and have driven results. I think they've just at the end of last year, they were up 10%. I've never seen, in all the data I've been looking at, I've never seen a service in that period of time go up by that amount. And that's mostly because of their hard work. They've also, thankfully, now got this software which will help them to make even more smart decisions in the future in terms of strategic workforce planning. And I wish them all the very best, and hope to see over coming months that trend still goes up, really, because it gives Steve more substance, a national level to talk about. And it's
10% is significant.
Oh yeah, it's phenomenal. And it's over a short period of time. So I'm not going to over egg the pudding and say, oh well, everything's right. I'm sure Steve would speak to that himself. Say, look, let's sit back. Let's keep doing the right things, as we heard at the conference. Let's keep nudging the ship in the right direction, making the small changes make a difference, and then we'll just see where it goes. But it's about the trajectory and not the destination, Tristan, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is, like in terms of the moment, how you feel on that service. It's clear that there's people in that service are feeling passionate, are feeling driven, and are feeling valued as firefighters if they're increasing their performance like that. So if they can maintain that, then I hope that they do. And then to speak to is really, saying the reason why, what more can be done. I think the big reason why I created Re-Enkindle, and sort of almost what in academic terms you call an ALTAC, I sort of pivoted out to say, well, how can I support the fire sector more than just continue to do research only, is because, as the NFCC have recognised with their ASA position and their and the Home Office proposed with the College of Fire, there's leaders, and I see them all the time, who are at capacity, who are being given projects. I think you've talked to this before, being given projects to manage, like on-call reviews, like on-call improvement programs, as well as doing other projects and all their operational duties. And so it's no criticism of them that sometimes they don't get seen through to the end, that they're not always completely successful, or that they don't always get the energy that they deserve. It's because they're, like all the public services, they're under-resourced and overworked. And so I realized actually I can come alongside organizations and say, well, I can provide you with a bit of capacity. If it comes to anything that's on-call orientated, then that's what I'm here for. I understand the context. I'm an on-call firefighter, and I've done this body of work and done various projects with services that, thankfully, touch wood at the moment, seem to be on the right trajectory. Shropshire is sustaining its success. Mid and West Wales is increased. Craig actually gave you a really good statistic. I think their improvements have provided 363 days extra cover across the service by that 2.4% increase. Lancashire, 10%. These are Nottinghamshire we heard from, albeit I haven't worked with Nottinghamshire, but they're doing great things. So it's far from broken.
But I think the common denominator in all of this, Craig in Mid and West, it's not just Craig. I appreciate you've got Phil Morris, you've got Roger Thomas, you've got other people there, the key movers and shakers.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Steve, you've got Dee, you've got John, you've got others in Lancashire.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Kevin and Craig in Notts. My concern is those people are very much signed up. It's not broken. We move forward. These things are achievable. Mm-hmm. My concern is the services that have got a completely different mindset. They're the ones that we really need to be knocking on their door. Mm-hmm. They need to be challenged. They need to be held to account, not necessarily, I'm not talking about by us, but by the relevant stakeholders. And it just doesn't seem to be happening. Because, what they say, what gets measured gets done. I heard at a recent practitioners group, West Sussex availability for their on-call is 43%. Now, I don't know how well known that is within West Sussex County Council, but that should scare the living daylights out of the elected members, and they should be investing resources, finance, time, etc., into asking the question as to why that is, because it's clearly not sustainable. And is anyone else having these problems? And if they are or have, what have they been doing about it? Oh, Steve Sadler. I don't know whether you've tried to engage with services like, I'm not just picking on West Sussex, but I know that that's a fact because that's a stat that's been given me. But they're the services you need to really be speaking to quite urgently. Shropshire's been brilliant for decades, and they're in a really good place, and services like that are in a really good place to be able to stop the rot and turn the ship around. The other services worry me because what I don't want to see is another Warwickshire, where we've got somebody in there who has got a completely different and, in my view, wrong mindset, and looks to remove all of its on-call. And I don't want that to become a trend because, as you know better than anybody, once they're gone, that's it. And if you do your piece of work, or somebody, and I very much hope it is done, with regards to the economic, social and cultural value of on-call, for those services, it's going to be too late.
Yeah, it's we measure what we value what we measure, right? To speak to your point about, we've got to measure it, we've got to look at it. And just to go back a little bit in terms of mentioning those people who are key strategic leaders in those services that are, often already doing quite well and value their on-call, but then there's others that are on a different part of that trajectory and a different end of that availability graph. There are still others that have approached me that I'm working with, have worked with. I think you mentioned when you reached out, the report in Kent. There's another example of
that was it. I would love to pick your brains about
that. Kent, Matt Dedman and Paul Ramsden and their team that I work with down there, they are, again, absolutely on a mission to demonstrate to their on-call firefighters that they value them, that they're going to invest in them, that they're going to make smart decisions to help improve on-call fire engine availability. And they're in the southeast, and they're a service which is probably you can talk about in the same sort of context as all those other ones that are in and around London that have sometimes a bit of a different challenge in terms of the demographic profile of on-call firefighters, the economic situation, and people going into London and so on. But ultimately, there are services out there that I suppose my insights in the last 2 or 3 years has been, and the way I've started to talk about on-call availability more, is that actually I see the trend now to the positive. Looking at the on-call conference, hearing from Ireland, hearing from Mid and West Wales, hearing from Nottinghamshire, seeing how much time is being invested by those leaders, how much thought, how much money. I haven't really touched on Ireland, but Ireland recently had their review, and they've spent, they've got £50 million nationally to spend in a service that, again, has a predominance of on-call firefighters, and they've thrown a huge amount of money at recruitment and creating a really fantastic kind of new duty system, really, for their on-call, where they bifurcate their crewing so that they have almost like a watch within a station, where they've got, half their firefighters are available one week and the other half are flexible or unavailable. And that is actually a really resilient and smart way to crew an on-call station. And they've done some great things. So I'm seeing more and more that services are reaching out to me, contacting me, to help them, and that they're more orientated toward things like fire service rota, those services that realise they want to. There's the challenge really in the sector for strategic workforce planning and skills management in a context of Section 19, in the context of the number one threat to availability being a lack of incident commanders nationally. That those services who recognise that but want their on-call to work, they are saying, what do we need to do to improve our strategic workforce planning of on-call? And they're looking at systems like fire service rota more and more, which is every year adding services in the UK to its complement of services that it's facilitating. The same with oars, really. There's services are more and more interested in that and have started to use it across the UK. And that gives me tremendous hope that actually people are starting to, value what they measure and measure what they value. And I know that those two pieces of software in particular are allowing them to measure the right things, to do the right things. They're allowing them to look at things like effectively workforce planning and not performance management. It's that performance management doesn't really work in an on-call context. I could give you lots of examples of that. Whereas workforce planning does. If you say, what's the total percentage contribution of this on-call firefighter, of Steve Sadler, to this fire engine on a daily, hourly basis, based on his skills and how he aligns with the rest of the crew, just that one metric, you can use it in so many different ways to plan smartly. You can then identify who you want to join based on what hours availability they can give. This is like the holy grail that everybody's talked about for decades. Actually, when somebody comes to a local station and they say, hey, I want to give 160 hours cover, and the watch manager has to go, well, let's be realistic. Let's drop that a little bit. But these are the hours we need you to cover. That normally falls on the watch manager to know that, either intuitively or with some local data. But the software we've created allows them to just say, okay, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith, here's the hours that you can say you can provide. If you're to become an on-call firefighter, we'll just put them in the system now in a couple of minutes, and it will tell us not only what the potential benefit to availability profile at the station will be, it will tell us how we might attend more or less incidents. It also will allow us to pre-program you with skills so that if in 2 or 3 years you become an IC, how does that fill gaps in the future when we've got other people leaving? And so it allows you to not only manage your workforce in terms of what you've got now, but new people coming in to identify where, what hours they need to provide. That's a huge step on in terms of how the individual stations and the sector can start to manage its on-call resource, because we haven't really touched upon it, Tristan, but as you and I both know, the trend, despite all those good people trying to do some great things to recruit, to retain, all the research I've done, the trend is still downwards.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're still going from nearly 15,000 on-call firefighters in 2010 down to 2020. It was about 11,500, down to most recent data is about 8,000. Now that curve's just lessened off a little bit because there's also dual contractors to consider in there, but then we're using more dual contractors than ever before. So in the context of the on-call, strategic workforce planning is sort of like the number one priority. Let's get more out of what we've got. Let's value them more. Let's let them know that we're investing in them, and then let's plan effectively so that we can utilize them. What that also does is things like for training. That one thing I've heard in my whole journey as a firefighter and as a researcher is that the challenge of getting people into training to be incident commanders or emergency response drivers, and the right people who are going to help to keep the truck available based on the hours they can provide, is always a decision that's taken sort of in the dark. That actually is based on first come, first served, who's asked to see if there's a training course for driving, what training capacity is, And for the first time, software can allow you to understand that which person at an on-call station is the best place to upskill in order to become a driver to keep that truck on the run into the future. And then you can go to training with a data-driven approach and say, these people are going to take priority because these people are going to confer the most availability benefits. And at times where we have an incident profile that suggests we need cover for incidents, because that's another, we touched on that, just really this idea of availability, which is something we always talk about. Is that really an effective metric, that just single figure of is this fire engine available or not? Really the best way to view the challenges that we've got, because as you know, and I think we've had guests talk about before, and I know that Steve and Andy talked about in terms of the National Fire Chiefs Council research project at the moment, sometimes we're just comparing apples and pears. A fire engine being available,
absolutely.
The way availability is defined. So from that premise, the way it's defined is different according to what the service is doing in terms of its emergency response. And then it's just quantitative, so it's not qualitative. It doesn't look at what did they do when they were at an incident. Were they there second in attendance and they did something really meaningful? Were they there their third pump, fourth pump? What did they do when they were there? What kit did they use? What were they, and what type of incident was it? So again, OARS does that. It actually starts to allow us to look at availability beyond just, is it on or off? Is it binary, or is it actually it can be on here, and at that point we know that there's going to be this type of incident more likely based on historical data. So that's a really key point, to have crews available. And then how can we achieve that with our existing staff? Let's model some stuff to make sure that everybody's working together. But back to my original point, the person who is often best placed to do that, and that somehow has managed to do it for decades, is a watch manager, is a local station manager who intuitively has known this stuff and has been able to program their workforce and build in flexibility, just because they understand who the people are, what hours they provide, what they might be doing personally one day to the next, which means they need some time off and somebody else could cover them because of their shift pattern. This is stuff that local great watch managers have done for years and years and years, really.
And the frustrating thing is that fire services are data rich. So they have everything. They have the answer, don't they? They have the tools and the mechanism with which to solve this problem. And they haven't. And it's taken somebody like yourself to come along and put together this tool. And I think we just hope. I mean, is there a link that I can put in the show notes for OARS?
Yeah,
so
of course.
People can provide.
I'd love to. Yeah, of course.
So we can do that, and the same with Fire Service Rota, because we're not sponsored by Fire Service Rota, but I do understand that. I mean, going back to when I was in Norfolk, Rappel was implemented, and that was okay as the first step, and then Gartan come along and blew Rappel out of the water. But then, from what I've seen, Fire Service Rota has done exactly the same to Gartan. It is a fit-for-purpose piece of software that seeks to provide solutions to problems, and it is continuing to evolve, is my understanding.
Oh, 100%. And again, I know it's a strap line that's been stolen by some others, I think, really. I don't even know if Fire Service Rota originated with that, by firefighters for firefighters. It's really an important part, from my perspective, it's a really important part of any service's use of a system that corresponds to using data to drive change, insights, operational or organizational. Because as you spoke to, and you spoke with Connor was brilliant. Your previous podcast talking about data literacy, talking about, do people really understand what it is, how it's being used, and how it can be used effectively. I think a big part of that is insight. It's just so key. It's especially where I come from in research, where it can be quite abstracted, theoretical, people looking into a context from outside, even when they do understand the data or they do understand the research, but they haven't got that insight. Whereas, and I think that's hopefully my value to the sector, I do have that insight. It's real time, it's now. It's also in various different services. So I understand this idea of best practice and that every service is a little bit different, but that there's also these common denominators of success. And I understand research and data, so that when we're taking data-driven approaches to things, that I can put it into a context to help others or to create software ultimately. And that's what Fire Service Rota does, because it's firefighters. There's firefighters in the Netherlands that work with this software, that work in Fire Service Rota, and like me in the UK. And it means that decisions are always taken with the idea of, so what? Why would we do this? Well, how will this help to increase fire engine availability? How will this help to allow on-call firefighters to be available when needed, but free when possible? That's like a really key point. That's the holy grail, and that's what we're trying to achieve with data, not to scrutinize somebody's adherence to a contract. I learned many years ago that the total amount of time an on-call firefighter adheres to a contract is far less important than the total amount of time they contribute to on-call fire engine availability.
100%.
And in the context of the Grey Book changes now, which is moving more services towards standard approaches, or the opportunity to do so in accordance with what the Grey Book suggests is acceptable, means that landscape of contracts, hours, mismatched hours, people giving lots of hours but not the time that the fire engine needs to be available and to be attending the right type of incidents, more than ever we really need to manage it smartly. Because that was a part of the work we did in Shropshire, was that because of Adrian, I'm guessing this, Tristan, that Adrian Thomas said in 2015 that services should consider working towards a segmented salary approach, a banded approach, really. He was 10 years ago now, talking about, services should make contracts more flexible. And actually, despite it taking 10 years for that to be reflected in the Grey Book, many services did that a long time ago. Straight off the back of Adrian Thomas, they took that and they said, oh, let's give this a try. And part of the NFCC's working patterns group was identifying that, asking single points of contact in each service, what crewing pattern do you use, whole time and on call? Let's see if there's some patterns which seem to be more successful than others. What that did show when we did the analysis was more that actually those services that went from using a historical approach, let's say of 3/4 and full contracts of 84 or 90 and 120, that they went to banded, was that there was a bit of what we called the race to the bottom. That actually, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, and many of your listeners will be on-call firefighters, that more often than not, in a context where you can only increase pay by a nominal amount, on-call firefighters will rightly choose time over money. And what services were trying to do after 2015, it seems to me, based on a lot of their strategic documents, were things with the right reasons. They were trying to create more flexibility for the workforce, balance health and well-being, and on some level it does, but it also came at the cost of on-call fire engine availability, because there was all those on-call firefighters working less hours.
I think the problem was, and you're absolutely right about the Adrian Thomas report, services looked at that in isolation and thought, that's the silver bullet. That's all right. We'll put in a banding system and that will solve all the problems, without appreciating that it causes its own problems if not managed correctly, as you correctly identified. And it was really helpful that you identified that. I think I first was aware of your analysis of that at the Mid and West Wales conference, as the banding was being talked about, because by correctly identifying the fact that just implementing on their own is likely to mean that availability of appliances is going to reduce because of the race to the bottom. It's something that could be addressed in advance. However, the fire service, being the fire service in general, not only seems to have not heeded that warning, but some of the conversations that we're having in some services, they're making things 10 times worse by coming up with weird and wonderful things. Like one example I heard this week, where people will be put into a particular band, but they have to hit the dead center of that band. Doesn't matter whether they're currently providing less or more, they have to hit dead center. Now, the fire service is great at doing this. It creates a problem that doesn't need to exist. All that needed to happen, we spoke about this at the conference last year, when somebody raised the question, how are we going to implement the bans? It's really, really easy. You look at what your contract currently says and you work out which band you fit into, because all this is about pay. It's not about availability, it's about pay. But services, unfortunately, in my opinion, again, definitely don't want to put words in your mouth, are mismanaging this process to the detriment of the people who are providing the cover. And I think that's a massive shame, but it's a perfect example of why, in general, not including services that we've spoken about before in a positive light, but in general, services just seem to make things worse.
Yeah, it does speak to what we've talked about a little bit. I think time, capacity, full appreciation of the on-call context by those who are in that position to affect policy, affect changes to contracts. And it would be nice if more of them, reached out and expressed an interest in oars, because that's what it's there for. It allows services to do that when they don't have the capacity in house, or they haven't thought about it in those terms yet. Oars naturally allows that to happen, really. And what Oars also does is allow, because we're talking about incentives, aren't we? The primary motivations behind on-call firefighters. What Firefighter Pete on the podcast said was, it's all about outcomes, not incomes, which I quite liked. That was a good one. These primary motivations, this incentive, on some level, maybe pay has become more pronounced because of austerity, because of the cost of living crisis, because there's now been a bit of an uplift in pay. So that does just become a little bit more of an incentive to remain. It's still unlikely to be an incentive to recruitment particularly. But as we've touched on, a primary motivation of on-call firefighters, which has been borne out from two pieces of the research I've done, from engagement surveys, and I think the work you did, which we haven't really got to yet, in 2017, is the importance of activity levels. I know Damien West's research spoke to it as well in 2016 at Nottingham Trent University, what he called activity levels, what Kevin Tedds calls get them in the kit. Like that as an incentive for on-call firefighter is primary. It's far beyond pay. They sign up to do something and they want to get the opportunities to do it. Now, whether it's seen to be facilitated because of a great crewing system that allows them to do so, or a great piece of software that allows more of them to be available, or fire engines that are bigger than normal with more seats than less. All of these things engender self-actualization, allow for an on-call context to support firefighters who want to do those things. Similarly, that's what Oars allows us to do, because it allows us to say to on-call firefighters, if you're more available at this period in time, the truck will be more available at this period in time, and there's more incidents at this period of time, so you're more likely over the course of the next year to attend, let's say, 10, 20 more incidents. All of a sudden you're incentivizing on-call firefighters with one of their primary incentives, activity, doing the job. And Oars is the that allows that, because it aligns and layers in incident data with availability data, which has kind of been a holy grail of the sector and the on-call element for a long time. I've heard a lot of smart, strategic senior executives say exactly that. We need to do this. We need to do this. And that's kind of was my call to action. I thought, I could keep doing a review, go to the next service, go to Middle West Wales, then go to Kent, and go to Lancashire, and then whoever's next. But actually, there's these things that we can measure to do the right things, and we can provide a tool in order for people to do it and empower them and create more impact. Because I could be going for the next 25 years, Tristan, doing a service or two a year. And as you say, then things change, and it's just, I've become outdated and I'm already too old for that. So that's kind of where Oars is. Let's incentivize the right behaviors in order to get firefighters in the kit, get them recruited, and ultimately they'll stay longer. That turnover cycle, we want to reduce that. We talked about that before as well. Good services, one of their metrics of success is clearly tenure. It's the length of time that those on-call firefighters are staying. The longer you can keep them, the better the benefit, especially in the context of a dearth of skills, where we've less and less drivers, less and less incident commanders. So that's
So what's your view? I'm interested in your view with regards to the actual recruitment process, and I'll give you a real life example. Somebody saw an advert on social media, and I'm deliberately not going to name the brigade. Said we're having an open day. There was a fair or something in the town. The appliance was there. Come along, find out a bit more. So this individual did exactly that. Came along really enthusiastic, liked what he saw, good reception with the local crew, fantastic. All the details were taken. 2 months pass, nothing. This appliance is regularly off the run. This appliance is desperate for crew. And I keep speaking to this individual. Have you heard yet? Have you heard yet? Have you heard yet? No. Which frustrates the hell out of me, because invariably service will look at 3 or 4 recruits courses per year. My view, and I'm really interested in your view, is you don't need to wait for 3 or 4 courses a year. You can do it ad hoc. You can do a hybrid situation where even, worst case scenario, you've got one individual. That one individual, as your data set will confirm, could make a huge difference in terms of pump availability, in terms of activity levels, etc. That individual could undertake a very streamlined process of a medical, fitness, etc., get their hands on some tools on the station, on a nearby station, or wherever. They do not need to wait potentially 3 or 4 months from expression of interest to actually being invited in. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of it. I would say that, like you, Tristan, I've dealt with a lot of services now across the country and seen innovation, seen new approaches, seen ways to try and get new recruits interested to begin with, the hook, and then try and keep them on the hook, which is, I think, what you're referring to really, despite sometimes those, what in the literature it's often referred to as barriers to entry. So there's been quite a lot of good research and various different UK reports really looking at that and saying, look, why are we, effectively seems to be putting those barriers to entry up. And I think, as I've heard from a few services, there are some that have done exactly what you've said, that they've gone, well, what we do is we get one on-call firefighter. We know that they've gone past their initial tech checks that we can do. They're interested, they've been engaging, and then we're going to send all the resource to them. We're going to send all the resource to the local fire station and say, right, in a day or so, we're going to get you through that process, through the administrative process, which is a big barrier to entry. We're going to help you to surmount any IT barriers, because we're going to be there at the station with you doing it. So when you can't log on, or you can't, check your email, or you can't register your DBS check, they can help you with that there and then. We can do the fitness on the drill yard there and then. And I've seen that there are services that have really, took some smart approaches. But again, it's that concerted effort, and none of it seems to make more impact than when you've got a local watch manager or a local team that are doing all that for you anyway. They're sort of ameliorating all those problems with barriers to entry by engaging that person locally. My research shows that most recruitment comes locally, word of mouth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Despite your great work online and social media and the time you're spending trying to raise awareness, actually on-call fire campaigns for the NFCC, they're good, they're important, but actually the majority is, if you've got a local station with a great culture, not only is that going to have a better retention level, which is going to feed out into the community and within that station to make people speak highly of the fire station in the local community and have a good network out. It means that when they come in, that they're going to be supported by that good culture on that station to get over those barriers to entry. Keep engaging them on drill night, keep inviting them in, keep supporting them, saying, some services have created teams to do that. So RSOs or group support teams, as Kevin spoke about, that can be one of their roles, as well as going from station to station to cover availability and shortfalls in skills. They can also fulfill that sort of training and support role, and really good retained support officers and those teams I've seen across the UK, they do that in a really positive way, and they help with recruitment. Fundamentally, that's again the watch manager, the local management often saying, right, let's get this person on board, let's wrap our arms around them, because as you say, they're part of my French, like rocking horse. There's so few of them that when they're there, let's absolutely treat them as a precious finite resource and support them in every way we possibly can. There are services doing that in the right way, I think. It's just, that's still, I know it's counterintuitive. The recruitment I've seen is improved through retention. The better your retention, and therefore the better generally the culture at the station, it becomes cyclical, and it just behooves good recruitment. And then keeping those staff for a long period of time to become good recruiters and to have the skills that are those things which keep that truck on the run. Because you can have, we use this analogy a lot in Shropshire when we're doing the research, you can have that bucket, and you can keep pouring, you can have the best recruitment campaign in the world and you can keep pouring those recruits in. But if your bucket's got holes in it and they're just, and you're losing them every 2, 3, 4 years, which is the case in some services, and some of the data that I've looked at, that's very much the case. They're really good at recruiting. They actually get a huge number through, but then the attrition rate is so high through training, as you point out, because it becomes onerous. Through training, because it's not what they thought it was going to be, and they get to initial training and beyond, and there's like a value misalignment. And there's a good piece of research, or a couple of good pieces of research that reflect this really. This is the idea of the volunteer cycles, which is analogous to on-call firefighters, where in the first 3 years in the volunteer sector and in the on-call, you often find that people sort of spin out and leave because of that value misalignment, because of that expectation mismatch. They didn't think that they're going to have to do so many hours. They didn't think they were going to get so few interesting call outs, let's say, at a local small station, various different things, which mean that they drop out after about 3 years. Then between 3 to 8 years, you generally get people that stay. If they subvert that 3-year cycle, they go on to be 8 years. But at 8 years, there's a different reason for the resignations, and they tend to be despondency. People who feel like they've seen it, done it, it's time to move on. Generally people that gravitate towards the fire and rescue service are high risk takers, want a challenge, and after 8 years of doing a job, they go, I'm on to the next thing really. And there's also those that then don't want to follow a certain pathway, like to become drivers or incident commanders. They don't want to progress in that way, and so they want some more development and personal development, so they go elsewhere. So there's two sort of pinch points for retention that I don't think we talk about enough in the sector, because you've got to speak to those different people at different times with your policies, with your retention processes, so that you can have those good informed conversations based on that person's motivations and priorities. And again, I keep saying it, it's a watch manager. A great watch manager knows that about that person, and they know, this is the person that thought they were signing up for 400, or what was it, Finlay's 440 shouts.
That's for the
activity levels. They're not hit that activity level. They're not getting the interest. They're not self-actualizing. The money's not what they thought it was going to be. The service isn't. The culture isn't. All of it's just misaligned, and they're going. That's where a watch manager can step in, or the crew can step in support and say, but there's these other things that we can do, and we're here for you. Likewise, at the 8-year point, that's where you can start to have more conversations. Let's reduce the barrier to entry for you becoming an emergency response driver or an IC, because let's speak to the crew. Let's have some mentoring from somebody that didn't want to do incident command but has ended up doing it, or encouraged to do it, and now they love it and it's the best thing for them about the job, and it's helped the individual through the support of the on-call team to subvert that pinch point and that possible loss of an invaluable resource, because they were just weren't aware that this would be something for them at the next stage of their career. So I think that the recruitment is really important, but we still are actually in many services and many stations getting enough recruits. I would say at this stage, retention is the bigger challenge, and skills utilization is the bigger challenge.
And that's where services need to talk to one another, because you've got one service is over here doing the recruitment right, but unfortunately they've got too many leaving, and another service with great retention levels, but just can't get people in.
And recruitment is driven locally as well. That's what I've noticed. So by the local demographic profile, by who's available, who's moved out, are there any digital nomads that are now increasing in your rural area, which means you've got more people to recruit from, or you're in an area where there's just one local factory that recruited all your, where you used to get all your on-call recruits. So to some extent, the recruitment element is that which it's not in the service's power. It can create a great campaign, it can do it, but the retention aspect is creating a good culture and utilizing those people effectively when they're in, so that they feel valued, recognized, and they get to do things they want to do. That is within the power of each fire and rescue service. So I always say really that the retention should be the focus. But as Kevin rightly pointed out, and as our first research spoke to, with the multiple facets, the 3 R's, the 3 S's, the 3 C's, you've got to do all of it all the time. Just go, oh yeah, that's a success now. Got to keep recruiting smartly, got to keep retaining, got to, we haven't touched on it yet then, but do some more things more smartly. I think with resignation data, we can use some good social research methods which allow us to really understand why on-call firefighters are leaving. There's actually a piece of research that was done in the Netherlands in 2014 by the University of Twente by somebody called Tamo Vogel. He's a fire officer in the Netherlands and needed an intention to remain study, which looked at on-call firefighters across the Netherlands and said, we realised that just asking them whether or not they're going to stay as an on-call firefighter is pretty meaningless and not a very robust way of conducting research, because generally they won't know, they won't give the right answer, not because they aren't speaking the truth, but because they don't know themselves. They haven't self-reflected enough to genuinely know. But what we can do, and is well trodden path in social research methods, is ask them questions behind that primary question. If we want to know why an on-call firefighter is going to leave or intends to remain, we can ask a set of questions behind that, such as, does your spouse or partner support you in your role? Does your primary employer? Do you feel you're going to pass your fitness in the next few years? Do you feel like there's enough career progression? And then what you do is a logistical regression analysis to say, where's the statistically significant data points, and what does that tell us about the likelihood of these firefighters in this service and their intentions to remain? That can be a great data point for a service to plan ahead and look and go, we've got all these firefighters that have said this, which means that as part of our forecasting for availability, we can pretty much confidently say, or at least statistically significantly say, our workforce number is going to drop to this. And so you get more rich data really to start to create your strategic workforce plans. So there's loads of bits and multiple facets that you can do and that need doing, which the good services seem to do. Like Nottingham, which talked about, they realise that we've got to do all the smart things. We've got to be smart with the data. We've got to smart with the availability system, smart with our planning and our skills utilisation. But that's just one part. We don't have to be performance managing and micromanaging. We just use it to make some key important decisions to do with training and supporting the workforce. There's loads of little nudges in the right direction that can make a big improvement.
So I failed miserably because beforehand I said I was going to try and manage this pod so it was 50 to 60 minutes long. I knew I was going to struggle. Listen, Steve, we've done an hour and 25 minutes or thereabouts. We could quite easily do another hour and 25 minutes. So I think we're going to have you back.
That'd be great.
I know lots of people have been looking forward to this pod because when you speak, people listen within the fire service because you know your stuff around on call and what needs to be done. And I do hope that this podcast gets shared widely. I hope lots of services will realise that they need to speak to you and find out more about the work that you've undertaken and the work that you potentially can undertake for them as well in future. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, I'm going to say thanks because it's been brilliant. I've sat here and just listened to you and enjoyed it myself. So I'm going to go back and listen to it all again because there's going to be bits and bobs that I haven't quite absorbed. Mm-hmm. But if you're happy to, I would love to have you back because there's so much more that we can discuss.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And keep up the great work. I was reflecting on the podcast and listening to some of your other podcasts before I came to speak with you today, really. And one thing I hadn't thought about was the name of your podcast, the priority message. I'd not really thought about that before. Obviously, I understand the connotations for the operational workforce and what that means, but I wanted to end by saying thank you, and that the priority message from me, I hope today, has been that I'm passionate about the on-call. If only because of its economic, social, and cultural value to me, my family, us as taxpayers, to everybody in the wider world. This is something which deserves investment, support, time, energy. We just got to sustain it, and the notion that it's not sustainable, hopefully, has been confounded by you recently, by the work I do. And I would encourage, any fire and rescue service who want to talk about how they can smartly use data, research, anything to improve their on-call availability, to get in touch with me. Really, I'd love to have the conversation, and always do all the time anyway, just because I think that's a big part of it, having these conversations and raising awareness of the on-call in a positive light. And you're doing a great job at that, Tristan, so thank you.
That's very kind. So what we'll do is we'll put all your details in the show notes, and anything else that you think is particularly useful, plus the stuff that we've spoken about already. So if anybody would like to contact Steve, all they need to do is look at the show notes, and all the details and the links will be made available. So from me and Steve, for the first episode of the third series of Priority Message, thanks very much for listening. Subscribe, like, tell your friends and colleagues, and I'll see you on the next one.